What's going on? It's Joe Teal, and this is another episode of the Agnostic Bible Study. This podcast is usually a verse-by-verse breakdown, and that's what you can expect every single Tuesday. But today is Thursday, and on some Thursdays, I'll be dropping explainer episodes that help fill in the blanks a little bit and help us give more context, kind of like the first 3 episodes that we did of the show. We'll still be approaching all this with a neutral, curious perspective. We're going to slow down, open up the text, and ask honest questions. So whether you believe, you don't believe, or you don't know what to believe, you are welcome here at the Agnostic Bible Study. Let's get into it. Today's explainer is on Markan priority. Markan priority is when you think that Mark was the first written gospel. So today I'll be laying out some evidence that I feel points towards that, but like always, it's up to you to build your own conclusion. Don't let me tell you how to believe. In order to see Markan priority, we mainly need to look at the Synoptic Gospels. When most people open the New Testament, they see 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But 3 of those, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are closely related. They share many of the same stories, often in the same order, sometimes using very similar wording. And because of this, those are known as the Synoptic Gospels. And the word synoptic simply just means seen together. It refers to the fact that these Gospels can be placed side by side and compared line by line. When scholars began doing that, they started noticing some patterns. Sometimes the wording is nearly identical. Sometimes one version of the story is longer or shorter than another. Sometimes details appear added, removed, or slightly changed. That raises an important historical question. How are these 3 Gospels related to each other? Were they written completely independently? Are they drawing from shared oral traditions? Or did one author have access to another written Gospel? This puzzle is known as the Synoptic Problem. Not a problem in the sense that something is wrong, but a literary question scholars have tried to understand for centuries. One of the most widely accepted solutions today is called Markan priority. The idea that the Gospel of Mark was likely written first and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources in their own account. Before getting into the argument for that, it helps to see just how closely these Gospels can align sometimes. One of the clearest examples for Mark and Matthew, for example, is when Jesus calls his first disciples. Let's read Mark and Matthew's version. We're going to start with Mark, and we're in chapter 1, verse 16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boats mending their nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. And then we'll jump back over to Matthew chapter 4, verse 18. As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Looking at both of those so closely, and I'll have both of these on the screen, something interesting happens. The same sequence appears, the same characters, the same setting, even much of the same wording. Jesus walks by the Sea of Galilee. He calls Simon and Andrew. He tells them to follow him and become fishers of men. They immediately leave their nets. Then he calls James and John, who leave their father in the boat and follow him. When these passages are placed side by side, the similarities are hard to miss. The structure is nearly identical. The order is identical. And in Greek, several phrases are extremely close. When this kind of overlap appears in one story, it could be coincidence. But if it shows up across dozens of passages, scholars begin asking whether some kind of literary relationship exists. Are these authors independently telling the same stories? Or is one of them using another written account as a source? That question is what eventually led many scholars to conclude that one gospel may sit at the center of this relationship. And for many, that gospel appears to be Mark. Now, this may feel strange to you because when you open up your New Testament, it says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And for a long time, that was generally thought of as the correct order. But as of about 200 years ago, the scholarly consensus has changed. The original church tradition that Matthew was written first has definitely been put to the test. Now, these similarities don't mean that the Gospels are identical, and it doesn't mean that Mark was the only source used. It suggests that there is a literary relationship between these texts. Instead of 4 completely independent biographies, we may be looking at documents that are connected to one another. And to understand why many scholars think Mark may have come first, we have to start with one of the simplest observations. Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels. It contains 16 chapters compared to 28 in Matthew and 24 in Luke. But the argument is not just about length. It's also about what Mark does and does not include. Mark contains no birth narrative, no genealogy, no extending teaching sessions like the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, one of the greatest sermons ever, and Mark doesn't have it. And in its earliest manuscript form, it ends abruptly at Mark 16:8, without recorded resurrection appearances. And that's worth looking into, because if you go to the end of Mark, chapter 16, and you go down to verse 9, it's typically in brackets, because this whole last piece of Mark is not found in the earliest manuscripts. So both Matthew and Luke include genealogies. Both of them include birth narratives. Both of them include expanded resurrection accounts. If Mark were written later, many scholars ask why these major narrative and theological sections would be removed. But if Mark came first, it becomes easier to understand how later authors might expand the story with additional material. We can see this pattern in individual stories as well. In Mark's version of Jesus walking on the water in Mark 6:45 through 52, the scene is brief and direct. I'll read it. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So Jesus walks on the sea, the disciples are afraid, he speaks to them, the scene ends. But when Matthew tells the same story in Matthew 14:22 through 33, he follows Mark's structure closely, but adds several elements. Let's read those verses real fast. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." They cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those on the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So as you can see, the beginning of that was super close. But then Matthew adds a whole extra scene, Peter stepping out into the water. Peter begins to sink, Jesus rescues him, and the disciples respond by worshiping him. The core event remains the same, but Matthew expands the scene and makes the meaning more explicit. Many scholars view this as an example of later development building on Mark's framework. There's one more observation scholars often point out when discussing the relationship between the Gospels, and this one is huge. When the same story appears in Mark and then in Matthew or Luke, Mark's Greek is often more rough and less polished. Mark tends to use a simpler sentence structure. He frequently repeats words and phrases. He moves quickly from one moment to the next using the word immediately. Side note, he uses the word immediately over 40 times in his gospel, and sometimes his grammar feels more abrupt. When Matthew and Luke tell the same stories, they often smooth out that language. They refine sentence structures, they remove some repetition, and they occasionally clarify wording. And overall, the Greek often reads as more polished and developed. If Mark were written later, it would be somewhat unusual for him to consistently simplify and roughen material that already existed in a more refined Greek form. But if Mark came first, it makes sense that later authors might preserve his structure while presenting the material in a more polished literary style. This pattern of refinement is another reason why many scholars think that Mark may have been written first. Scholars also point to places where Matthew appears to slightly adjust or refine Mark's wording while telling the same story. One example appears in the rejection of Nazareth. In Mark 6:1-1-6, the text says Jesus could not do any mighty work there, except for healing a few people. That phrasing has stood out to readers for centuries. When Matthew tells the same story in Matthew 13:53-58, he changes the word slightly. Let's read those. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, among their own kin, and in their own house. And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief." That's a big one. Now we flip over to Matthew. But Jesus said, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometowns and in their own house. And he did not do many deeds of power there because of their unbelief." Instead of saying Jesus could not do mighty works, Matthew writes that he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. The difference is subtle, but it shifts the tone. Mark says he could not. Matthew says he did not. And another example appears in the story often called the rich young ruler. In Mark chapter 10:17-22, a man approaches Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responds, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." When he tells that same story in Matthew 19:16-22, he adjusts the wording. Instead of focusing on why Jesus is called good, Matthew has Jesus respond, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" The core story remains true, but the phrasing is slightly reframed. I remember when I first read that verse in Mark, and I can't believe Jesus answered, "Why do you call me good? Only God is good." And I'm thinking, if God is good alone, then what does that make Jesus? Does that mean Jesus isn't good? But Matthew seems to rephrase the conversation, and it looks like to me he has softened what Mark said. Many scholars see these kinds of small adjustments as possible examples of later authors preserving earlier material while refining and clarifying certain phrases. These differences do not prove literary dependency on their own, but when similar patterns appear across many shared passages, they become part of a larger discussion about how the Gospels may be related to one another. Another observation scholars often make is that Matthew and Luke frequently follow Mark's overall order of events. In many cases, entire sections appear in the same sequence. For example, if you place Mark chapter 1 next to Matthew chapter 3 and 4, the structure is remarkably similar. John the Baptist appears. Jesus is baptized. Jesus goes into the wilderness. He begins preaching. Then he calls his first disciples. Matthew adds material and expands certain moments, but the underlying sequence closely follows Mark's structure. This kind of alignment happens repeatedly all throughout the Synoptic Gospels. This next point is big because you could just say, like, how do we know Mark is not following Matthew, or Mark and Luke are following Matthew, or Mark and Matthew are following Luke? This is why. When Matthew and Luke depart from Mark's order, they rarely agree with each other against Mark. Most of the time, at least one of them continues to follow Mark's sequence. Because of this, many scholars suggest that Mark may have provided a kind of narrative backbone for both Matthew and Luke. But this also raises an interesting historical question. Early church tradition sometimes claims that Mark's gospel was not written in strict chronological order. If you go back to my episode about who wrote the Gospel of Mark, we get the church tradition from Papias that says that Mark was an interpreter of Peter, and he wrote down Peter's sermons the best that he could remember, but not in order. So if that tradition was widely known, it raises the question of why Matthew and Luke seem to follow Mark's sequence so often. if that particular church tradition is right and Mark is not in chronological order, then we can naturally assume that Matthew and Luke are not in chronological order either. It may suggest that they were using Mark as a structured source without viewing it as disordered, or it may suggest that when they do adjust the sequence, they may be attempting to clarify or reshape the order for their own purposes. So maybe they don't know it's out of order, or maybe when the order does change, it's Matthew and Luke attempting to fix Mark's order. Either way, the close structural alignment between the Gospels is one of the reasons many scholars see a strong literary relationship between them. And you might ask, what about other sources? But just because there's 90% of Mark in Matthew and about 50 to 60% of Mark in Luke, Matthew and Luke must have some other source to explain that other material. So Markan priority doesn't mean that Mark was their only source. Many scholars believe Matthew and Luke also drew from oral traditions, other written material, and possibly a sayings collection often called Q. There is disagreement about the details, but the majority position in modern scholarship remains that Mark was likely written first. Understanding this does not settle any theological questions, but it does help us understand how these texts may relate to one another historically and literarily. Instead of four completely independent accounts, we begin to see a literary relationship between them. And once those patterns become visible, they are difficult to ignore. As we continue studying the Gospel of Mark in this series, keeping this possibility in mind may shape how we understand the text, not dramatically, but thoughtfully. So I'm not here to try to force you to think that Mark wrote first. My job is more of just putting the information out there and showing you that there is this argument for it. What you do with this information is up to you, and I always want you to make your own conclusions. I don't want you to walk around and say, I believe this because Joe said so, or I believe this because Wes Huff said this, or because Bart Ehrman said this, or whoever you're looking to and whoever you trust. I will share my opinion. I think Mark wrote first, and I think a lot of these examples make a lot of sense, especially the more I dive into Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I look at the patterns. So once again, thank you for hanging out with me at the Agnostic Bible Study. This podcast is trying to approach all this from a neutral, curious perspective. So whether you believe, you don't believe, or you don't know what to believe, I hope you're still finding some value here. So I will see y'all back here again on Tuesday where we get into our next section of Mark. And as always, I encourage you, never stop learning. We'll see you later.